Shukri al-Quwatli was the first president of post-independence Syria. He began his career as a dissident working towards the independence and unity of the Ottoman Empire's Arab territories, and was consequently imprisoned and tortured for his activism. When the Kingdom of Syria was established, Quwatli became a government official, though he was disillusioned with monarchism and co-founded the Republican Independence Party. Quwatli was immediately sentenced to death by the French, who took control over Syria in 1920. Afterward, he based himself in Cairo, where he served as the chief ambassador of the Syrian Palestinian Congress, cultivating particularly strong ties with Saudi Arabia. He used these connections to help finance the Great Syrian Revolt. In 1930, the French authorities pardoned Quwatli, and thereafter, he returned to Syria, where he gradually became a principal leader of the national bloc. He was elected president of Syria in 1943 and oversaw the country's independence 3 years later. Quwatli was re-elected in 1948, but was toppled in a military coup in 1949. He subsequently went into exile in Egypt, returning to Syria in 1955 to participate in the presidential election, which he won, a conservative presiding over an increasingly leftist-dominated government. Quwatli officially adopted neutralism amid the Cold War. After his request for aid from the United States was denied, he drew closer to the Eastern Bloc. He also entered Syria into a defense arrangement with Egypt and Saudi Arabia to confront the influence of the Baghdad Pact. In 1957, Quwatli, who to the US and the Pact countries attempted but failed to oust, sought to stem the leftist tide in Syria, but to no avail. By then, his political authority had receded as the military increasingly bypassed Quwatli's jurisdiction by separately coordinating with Quwatli's erstwhile backer, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. In 1958, after months of unity talks, Quwatli merged Syria with Egypt to form the United Arab Republic and stepped down for Nasser to serve as president. In gratitude, Nasser awarded Quwatli the honorary title of First Arab Citizen. Quwatli grew disenchanted with the Union, believing it had reduced Syria to a police state subordinate to Egypt. He supported Syria's secession in 1961, but plans for him to finish his presidential term afterward did not materialize. Quwatli left Syria following the 1963 Ba'athist coup, and he died of a heart attack in Lebanon weeks after Syria's defeat in the 1967 Six-Day War. He was buried in Damascus on the 1st of July. Personal life. Family. The Quwatlis were a family of merchants who became wealthy from trading with Arabia, and moved to Damascus from Baghdad in the 18th century. The family established itself in the district of al-Shafar in Damascus, and by 1860, some of the family's wealth was invested in buying large tracts of land in the Ghouta farms surrounding Damascus. The family's notable status was owed to the wealth, rather than an aristocratic or religious lineage, and the traditional spheres of activity were commerce and the Ottoman civil service. Shukri's grandfather, Abd al-Ghani, was involved in finance, as well as his great-uncle, Ahmed, who was the president of the Agricultural Bank of Damascus. His other great-uncle, Murad, was a member of the Administrative Council for the city. His father's wealth rested on the highly fertile lands he owned, and later bequeathed to Shukri and his siblings. In the Ghouta, his older brother, Hassan, was elected president of the Damascus Chamber of Commerce and Agriculture. In 1928, Shukri al-Quwatli married Bahira al-Dawlati, a 19-year-old daughter of Nationalist Said al-Dawlati, whom Quwatli met while in jail in 1916. Shukri and Bahira had 5 children: Hassan, Mahmud, Huda, Hannah and Hala. Bahira al-Dalati died in 1989. Childhood and education. Shukri.Quwatli was born in Damascus in 1891. He received his elementary education at a Jesuit school in the city, then studied at the preparatory high school of Maktab Anbar in the Jewish quarter of Damascus. He obtained his baccalaureate in 1908. He then moved to Istanbul where he studied political science and public administration. Quwatli graduated from the Mekteb-i Mulkiya in 1913. He returned to Damascus in 1913 after receiving his diploma, and started working for the Ottoman civil service. Early influences. Quwatli was initially brought up in a pro-Ottoman environment, owing to his family's connections in Istanbul. The restrictions of the Abdul Hamid II era, however, started to be felt around the Ottoman Empire, and discontent was brewing even among the empire's elite. Following the Young Turk Revolution against Abdul Hamid II in 1908, parliamentary elections were called in all provinces, and liberal Arab intellectuals like Shukri al-Asali, Shafiq Muayyad Ali Zedem, and Rushdie al-Shama secured seats as deputies representing Damascus. The liberal current that established itself through these figures, and the political dailies they established including Al-Qabiz and Al-Iqa al-Arabi, greatly influenced Quwatli and other Arab youths. During the Ottoman counter-coup of 1909, Quwatli strongly supported the Committee of Union and Progress against Abdul Hamid II. Nevertheless, after the failed counter-coups, the CUP accused Arab provinces of supporting Abdul Hamid II and initiated a policy of Turkification, whereby all local officials were substituted by Turkish ones. Soon after, the parliament was dissolved, and the liberal Arab politicians were forced out in the following elections. Early nationalist activities. Quwatli's early involvement in the Arab nationalist movement came through the Arab Congress of 1913. Shortly after starting his career at the Ottoman civil service in Damascus, he received an invitation to attend the conference in Paris. However, the conference was strongly condemned by the Ottoman authorities, and Arab notables were forbidden from attending. Nevertheless, the Congress had succeeded in rousing nationalist feelings in Arab provinces. Quwatli's first confrontation with the Ottoman authorities came in February 1914 during a visit by Jamal Pasha, the governor of Syria at the time, to the offices of the Governorate of Damascus where Quwatli worked. During the visit, Quwatli refused to follow the normal protocol, bending over and kissing Jamal Pasha's right hand, and was promptly thrown in prison at the citadel of Damascus. He was bailed out of prison a few days later through his family's connections, but he lost his job at the civil service. Al-Fatah. The growing hardships in the country during the early years of World War I pushed Quwatli to join the secret society of Al-Fatah, which was facilitated by his childhood friend and co-founder, Nasib al-Bakri. Al-Fatah was an underground organization established in Paris in 1911 by Arab nationalists with the aim of gaining independence and unity of the various Arab territories in the Ottoman Empire. In 1913, the society established its main branch in Damascus, and was successful in attracting the Syrian elite into its ranks. In 1915, Sharif Hussein, trying to garner support for his planned uprising against the Ottomans, sent his son Faisal to Damascus to lobby the Syrian notables on his behalf. Faisal, a member of Al-Fatah himself, met secretly with other members of the society, including Quwatli, in the house of Nasib al-Bakri. When the Ottoman authorities learned of the meeting, they ordered the arrest of al-Bakri and his two brothers, Fawzi and Sami, accusing them of treason. Quwatli was charged by the al-Fatah leadership with the task of facilitating their escape, in which he succeeded. In retaliation, Ottoman authorities placed him under arrest, in which he was subjected to torture and humiliation. Nevertheless, Quwatli refused to confess to anything, and his captors failed to implicate him in the operation, so they released him a month later. The tremendous pressure of that experience, however, took its toll on the young Quwatli, and upon his release he retired to his country house in Sidna and stopped all contacts with members of al-Fatah and the opposition. In late 1916 he was approached by Farsi al-Ayubi in hope that Quwatli could help him secure an escape route for his ailing father, Shukri al-Ayubi, who was arrested by the Ottomans, like he did for Nasib al-Bakri. However, despite Quwatli's refusal to help, Ottoman authorities tracked down the contact and arrested both men. Quwatli was subjected to further torture to coerce him to reveal the names of his al-Fatah colleagues. In an attempt to prevent himself from surrendering the names, Quwatli tried to commit suicide. After cutting his wrists, Quwatli's life was saved at the last minute by fellow inmate, al-Fatah member and practicing doctor, Ahmad Qadri. He spent 4 more months in jail, before being released on bail by his relative, Shafiq al-Quwatli, who served as a deputy at the Ottoman Parliament. On the 28th of January 1917. His experience in jail and the story about his attempted suicide turned Quwatli into a nationalist hero in Syria. Kingdom of Syria. On the 1st of October 1918, an Arab army under the leadership of Emir Faisal and British General T.E. Lawrence entered Damascus, and by the end of October the rest of Ottoman Syria fell to the Allied forces. Emir Faisal became in charge of administering the liberated territory. He appointed Rida al-Rikabi as prime minister, and Quwatli's friend, Nasib al-Bakri, became a personal advisor to the emir. Quwatli, at the age of 26, was appointed assistant to the governor of Damascus, Alaa al-Din al-Jurubi. However, many of Quwatli's generation were unimpressed with Faisal's leadership skills, and were drawn to a republican, rather than monarchist, view of governance. Furthermore, they were suspicious of Faisal and his brother Abdullah's ties with the British. On the 15th of April 1919 they founded a loose coalition under the name of al-Istiqlal Party. The party had a pan-Arab, secular, anti-British and anti-Hashemite outlook and attracted mostly youth activists from the elite classes. Well-known members, other than Quwatli, included Adil Arslan, Nabi al-Azma, Riyad al-Sul, Saadallah al-Jabiri, Ahmad Qadri, Izzat Darwaza and Uni Abd al-Hadi. Although ostensibly working for the government, Quwatli devoted his efforts to nationalist activities outside the government's auspices. In addition to al-Istiqlal, he was also a member of the Palestinian-led Arab Club's Damascus branch. In a meeting with the 1919 Cochrane Commission, sent by the United States to gauge national sentiment in Greater Syria, Quwatli rejected the notion of an American military presence in Syria, telling Crane that reduction of sovereignty is non-negotiable, and instead suggesting that the U.S. help Syrians to build the state and live in peace on the land. Nevertheless, French forces had already started landing on the Syrian coast in 1919 to enforce the Sykes-Picot Agreement, whereby France and the UK would divide up the former Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire between themselves. In March 1920, the League of Nations granted France a mandate over Syria and Lebanon, and in response Emir Faisal declared himself King of Syria on the 8th of March 1920. When King Faisal refused to accept the mandate, the French marched on Damascus. Yusuf al-Azma, Minister of Defense at the time, led a small force and met the French at the Battle of Mazalan on the 23rd of July 1920. The battle ended in a decisive victory for the French, and the next day French forces occupied Damascus. King Faisal was deported to Europe, and the French mandate for Syria and the Lebanon was officially declared. Leader in Syrian Independence movement. Emissary of the Syrian Palestinian Congress. The French started the rule by sentencing 21 nationalist leaders, including Quwatli, to death on 1 August 1920. Quwatli managed to flee only hours before a warrant for his arrest was issued. From Damascus he fled by car to Haifa in British-mandated Palestine, and soon after to Cairo in Egypt. For there, Quwatli spent the bulk of his time traveling throughout the Arab world and Europe, serving as the virtual ambassador of the Syrian Palestinian Congress. He became the chief link between Arab nationalist activists in Europe and in the Arab world. In Europe, he particularly frequented Berlin, where he worked with the prominent Arab nationalist intellectual Shukri to proliferate anti-French sentiment, leading the French mandatory authorities to label Quwatli one of the most dangerous Syrian exiles. He developed close ties with Ibn Saud, who by 1925 ruled much of Arabia, having overrun the Hashemites in the Hejaz. Quwatli had a prior relationship with the House of Saud, stemming from his own family's commercial links with the Saudis and Quwatli's friendship with Sheikh Yusuf Yassin, a Syrian advisor to Ibn Saud, who Quwatli had dispatched to Arabia during Faisal's rule. Quwatli, strongly distrustful of the Hashemites, was impressed by Ibn Saud's relatively quick conquest over much of Arabia and saw in the Saudis a strong potential ally against British and French imperialism in the Middle East. By 1925, Quwatli had solidified his position as the intermediary between Ibn Saud and the Syrian Palestinian Congress. His acquisition of Saudi funding put him at odds with the Congress's chief financier Michel Lutfauller, however, financing the Great Syrian Revolt. In the summer of 1925, tensions between the Druze chiefs of the Harand led by Sultan Pasha al-Atrash and the French authorities culminated with the Great Syrian Revolt, which spread throughout Syria within months. While Quwatli's Istiqlal Party lobbied the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, to set up a financial support network for the rebellion. Quwatli had already secured the funneling of funds and arms from the Hejaz and also diverted some of the military aid to the Jerusalem-based committee. As the revolt's initial momentum began to recede in mid-1926, bickering between opposition leaders, inside and outside of Syria, increased significantly. Quwatli was accused by his rivals in Cairo of pocketing some money he raised and paying off rebels to prevent rebel raids against his family's extensive apricot orchards in the Ghouta. Tensions between Istiqlalists like Quwatli and Arslan and other Syrian nationalist leaders like al-Bakri and Shabanda were particularly sharp, with the latter accusing Quwatli of being out of touch from the realities of the revolt, and Quwatli accusing Shabanda of treason for attempting to stop the insurrection. Role in the National Bloc. In late 1927, Quwatli headed the Istiqlal-dominated Executive Committee of the Syrian Palestinian Congress, although Lutfauller headed a separate rival committee that also called itself the Congress's Executive Committee. Both were based in Cairo. In 1930, Quwatli was allowed to return to Syria under general amnesty. Thereafter, he joined the National Bloc, the preeminent opposition movement in Syria, though tolerated by the French. Although he opposed the moderate stances of the bloc's Damascene leaders, He determined he could only remain a major political player by joining the group. He sought to steer it towards a more determined nationalist course and worked to expand his support base, relying on his relationships with residents in some of Damascus's traditionally nationalist neighborhoods and among the city's merchant and emerging industrialist classes. He also worked to draw support from the staunch pan-Arabists of the League of National Action beginning in 1933. He managed to co-opt much of the LNA's members by 1935–36 by financing its land development company and assigning some of its leaders to the director boards of companies affiliated with the bloc. In 1936, as a general strike was underway in the country to demand a renegotiation of the French role in Syria, Quwatli was appointed the bloc's vice president of internal affairs, but was not part of the treaty negotiation committee which led talks with the French in Paris in March. A new treaty was established by the end of the month, although the French did not ratify it. Between then and fall, Quwatli spearheaded efforts to unify nationalists' ranks in Syria, convincing LNA leader Sabri al-Assali to join the bloc's highest governing body. By enlisting the support of many prominent pan-Arabists like himself, Quwatli strengthened his position within the bloc, particularly in regards to his chief nationalist rival Jamil Mardam Bey. On the 20th of March 1941, during World War II, when the Vichy French were in control of Syria, Quwatli called for immediate Syrian independence amid a period of food shortages, high unemployment and widespread nationalist rioting in the country. Vichy troops in the country were defeated by the Allied forces in July, and Quwatli left Syria during the campaign. He returned in 1942. France officially recognized Syria's independence on the 27th of September. However, French troops were not withdrawn and national elections were postponed by the French mandatory authorities. First presidential term. Prior to the 1943 national elections in French mandatory Syria, the French authorities attempted to negotiate with Quwatli as head of the National Bloc to issue a treaty that guaranteed an independent Syria's alignment and close military cooperation with France, in return for French help in securing Quwatli's election to the presidency. Quwatli refused, believing the Syrian people would view such negotiations negatively. He was also confident that the National Bloc would win the elections regardless of French support. Quwatli did win the vote, becoming Syria's president on the 17th of August 1943. Syrian independence. As President, Quwatli continued to press for Syrian independence from France. In a bid to garner American and British support for his government, he declared war against the Axis powers, aligning Syria with the Allies. Growing countrywide unrest in response to French mandatory rule led to military assaults against Damascus and other Syrian cities in May 1945. More French troops were scheduled to land in Syria to aid the authorities, but at Quwatli's request for intervention, British troops invaded Syria from Transjordan, entering Damascus on the 1st of June. The French military campaign came to an immediate halt as a consequence. The UK and the US had viewed the French military action in Syria as a potential catalyst for further unrest throughout the Middle East and a detriment to British and American lines of communication in the region. As French troops began a partial withdrawal from the country, Quwatli instructed Fayez al-Khoury, his envoy to the US and head of the Syrian mission, petition to the United Nations to bring the issue of Syria's independence to the United Nations Security Council, cabling Cowrie to go to Truman and tell him the French have plowed the land in Syria over our heads. Cowrie proceeded to petition the UNSC to force France's withdrawal from Syria. The US and UK backed Syria's request and informed Quwatli that British troops were in control of Syria, requesting Quwatli's cooperation in enforcing an evening curfew in the country. Quwatli complied and expressed his gratitude to the British government. At a summit between France, the UK, the US, Russia and China, France agreed to withdraw from both Syria and Lebanon in return for British promises to withdraw its military from the Levant region as well. Quwatli was angered that Syria was left out of the conference and requested a summit with Truman and Winston Churchill, which was rebuffed. The transfer of administrative powers to the Syrian government began on the 1st of August, the day in which Quwatli announced the establishment of the Syrian army and his position as the commander-in-chief. Quwatli also asked Cowrie to form a cabinet, which was established on the 24th of August. The French finished the withdrawal from Syria on the 15th of April 1946 and Quwatli declared Syria's Independence Day on the 17th of April. Post-independence politics. Following Syria's independence, the National Bloc was dissolved and replaced by the National Party. Quwatli's leadership, while supported by older politicians like Asali, Jabiri and Haftar, became increasingly challenged by emerging leaders such as Nazim al-Quds of the People's Party and Akram al-Hourani of the Arab Socialist Party, as well as the Ba'ath Party, the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Syrian Communist Party. Antagonistic relations between Quwatli and the Hashemite kings of Iraq and Jordan, Abdullah and Faisal II, respectively, increased, with the latter two seeking to unite Syria, Iraq and Jordan under Hashemite monarchical rule, and Quwatli countering that Iraq and Jordan join a republican Syria under his leadership instead. The Hashemites found support in the People's Party, which became an influential force in Aleppo, a major city and economic hub of Syria, particularly after the 1947 death of Jabiri, Quwatli's Aleppo-based ally. In early 1947, Quwatli and the National Party, the largest party in parliament, made an amendment to the constitution to enable Quwatli to seek re-election. The move was met by strong disapproval from rival Syrian parties and opposition politicians, and a campaign to unseat Quwatli in the next presidential election was commenced. Quwatli's allies won 24 out of 127 seats during the 1947 parliamentary election, the first in post-independence Syria, while the opposition won 53 seats and independents unaffiliated with any political party won 50. A number of Quwatli's allies defected from the National Party and former President Atassi retired from politics because of his frustration at Quwatli's handling of Syrian internal affairs. Quwatli tasked Jamil Mardam-Bey to form a new cabinet in October, which included mostly pro-Western politicians. Despite the heavy presence of pro-American figures in the cabinet and Quwatli's initially warm ties with the U.S., relations between the two countries began to unravel amid the nascent Cold War and the view that Quwatli was becoming a detriment to U.S. interests in the region. Quwatli developed close relations with the SCP and its head Khalid Bakdash, which was a contributing factor to the U.S. Congress's rejection of Quwatli's arms request for the Syrian army in late 1947. Quwatli also rejected the construction of the Trans-Arabian Pipeline in Syria. Quwatli feared construction of the pipeline would threaten the mostly British-owned Iraq Petroleum Company and upset the UK, as well as the Syrian public, who he believed would view the project as a new form of indirect foreign economic control. According to Mubaid, U.S. support for Israel, particularly under Truman and Quwatli's adamant opposition to Zionism, was a further source of tension.